The morning awakening in ancient Greece. To properly understand why you would not last a day in ancient Greece, we must begin at the very beginning of Kor, the day which occurred at dawn. The ancient Greeks did not have alarm clocks, as these had not yet been invented. Instead, they relied on the natural light of the sun to wake them. This meant that their sleep schedule was closely tied to the cycles of day and night, which varied throughout the year. In summer, when the days were long, the Greeks would wake very early, perhaps around what we would call 5 o'clock in the morning. In winter, when the days were shorter, they might wake later, around 7 o'clock. This variability in wake time would be the first challenge you would face. Your body, accustomed to a regular alarm clock and perhaps a snooze button, would struggle to adapt to this irregular schedule, determined solely by sunrise. The sleeping arrangements in an ancient Greek home would also present difficulties. Most Greeks slept on wooden bed frames, with rope or leather straps stretched across them to support a mattress. This mattress was not like the modern mattresses we know today, with springs and foam padding. Rather, it was a cloth sack stuffed with wool, straw, or sometimes feathers if the family was wealthy. This would be much less comfortable than what you are accustomed to. The pillow, if there was one, would be similarly primitive. It might be a small cushion, stuffed with wool or feathers, or it might simply be a rolled-up piece of cloth. Some people used wooden or stone headrests, though these were more common in other ancient cultures such as Egypt. The lack of a comfortable pillow would make it difficult for you to get a good night's sleep, which would affect your ability to function throughout the day. The room in which you slept would likely be small and sparsely furnished. Ancient Greek homes were generally modest affairs, even for relatively wealthy families. The walls would be made of mud brick or stone, plastered and perhaps painted with simple designs. There would be few windows, and these would be small openings without glass, perhaps covered with wooden shutters. This meant that the room would be quite dark even and during the day, and there would be limited ventilation. Temperature control was another issue. In summer, the room could become quite hot, especially since the small windows provided limited airflow. In winter, it could become cold, as heating was provided only by portable braziers filled with charcoal. These braziers were fire hazards and also produced smoke and fumes that could be unpleasant or even dangerous in an enclosed space. You would need to balance the desire for warmth against the risk of fire and the discomfort of smoke. Upon waking, you would need to dress yourself. Ancient Greek clothing was quite different from modern clothing. Men typically wore a chiton, which was a simple tunic made from a rectangular piece of cloth. This cloth would be folded and pinned at the shoulders, then belted at the waist. The chiton might be knee-length or ankle-length, depending on the occasion and the wearer's social status. Women wore a similar garment, though theirs was typically longer and might be more elaborately arranged. The fabric of the chiton would most commonly be wool or linen. Wool was the more common choice for everyday wear, as it was readily available from the sheep that were kept throughout Greece. Linen, made from the flax plant, was more expensive and might be reserved for special occasions or for summer wear, as it was cooler than wool. The process of making these fabrics was labor-intensive, involving spinning thread from raw wool or flax fibers, then weaving the thread into cloth on a loom. Putting on a chiton required some practice and skill. You would need to arrange the cloth properly, pin it securely at the shoulders using fibula, which were decorative pins, similar to safety pins, and then belt it at the correct height. If you did this incorrectly, the chiton might hang awkwardly or even fall off. Modern people accustomed to clothes that are pre-sewn and simply pulled on would likely struggle with this process, especially in the dim light of an ancient Greek bedroom at dawn. Footwear presented another challenge. The ancient Greeks wore sandals for most occasions. These sandals were made of leather and consisted of a sole attached to the foot with straps. The straps might be quite simple or quite elaborate depending on the style and the wearer's wealth. Some sandals had straps that wound up the calf, while others had just a simple strap across the top of the foot and around the ankle. However, many Greeks went barefoot much of the time, especially indoors and around the home. The floors of Greek homes were typically made of packed earth, or in wealthier homes, stone or tile. These surfaces would be quite hard and uncomfortable for feet that are accustomed to walking on soft carpets and wearing cushioned shoes. Your feet would quickly become sore, and you might develop blisters or cuts from stones or rough surfaces. After dressing, you would need to attend to your morning hygiene. The ancient Greeks did not have running water in their homes, at least not in the way we understand it today. Water would need to be fetched from a well, a spring, or a public fountain. This task was typically assigned to women or slaves, and it involved carrying heavy clay jars, called amphorae, to the water source, filling them and carrying them back home. The Doi amphora was a large jar with two handles and a pointed bottom. It was designed to be carried on the head or shoulder, or but to be leaned against a wall, or placed in a stand, as the pointed bottom prevented it from standing upright on its own. An amphora full of water could weigh 20 to 30 pounds or more, and carrying it any distance would be quite strenuous. You would quickly become tired from this task, especially if you needed to make multiple trips to supply enough water for the household's needs. Once water was available, you would use it for washing. The Greeks did wash themselves, but the process was quite different from a modern shower or bath. You might pour water over yourself from a small jug, or you might wipe yourself down with a damp cloth. Soap, as we know, it did not exist. Instead, the Greeks used olive oil to clean their skin. They would rub oil onto their body, then scrape it off along with dirt and dead skin using a curved tool called a strigil. This process would be time-consuming and not particularly effective by modern standards. The oil would help remove some dirt and grime, but without soap and hot running water, you would not achieve the level of cleanliness you are accustomed to. You would likely feel somewhat grimy and uncomfortable, and this feeling would persist throughout the day. The ancient Greeks themselves did not have the same standards of cleanliness that we have today, so they would not have been bothered by this, but you certainly would be. Dental hygiene was similarly primitive. The Greeks did not have toothbrushes or toothpaste. They might clean their teeth by rubbing them with a cloth, perhaps with some abrasive powder made from crushed shells or pumice stone. Some people used twigs from certain trees, chewing on them to clean their teeth. These methods were not very effective, and most Greeks would have had stained, damaged teeth and bad breath. Dental problems were common and could be quite painful, as there were no dentists in the modern sense and no effective treatments for cavities or gum disease. After attending to hygiene, you would need to eat breakfast. The ancient Greek breakfast was typically a very simple affair, much simpler than what most modern people are accustomed to. It might consist of bread dipped in wine, perhaps with some olives or cheese. The bread would be made from barley or wheat, and it would be quite dense and heavy compared to modern bread. It would not be very flavorful, as the Greeks did not use much in the way of seasoning or sweetening in their everyday bread. The wine used at breakfast would be diluted with water. The Greeks almost always diluted their wine, considering it barbaric to drink it straight. The ratio of wine to water varied, but it might be anywhere from 1 part wine to 2 parts water, up to 1 part wine to 5 parts water or more. Even with this dilution, drinking wine at breakfast might seem strange to you. The wine would not be of the quality you might expect. It would be rough and acidic, quite different from modern wines. The olives would be preserved in brine, making them very salty. Ancient Greeks ate large quantities of olives, as olive trees grew well in the Greek climate, and olives were a valuable source of oil and nutrition. However, if you are not accustomed to eating salty preserved olives first thing in the morning, you might find them unpalatable. The cheese would be made from sheep or goat milk and would have a strong, tangy flavor quite different from mild modern cheeses. This breakfast would not provide very much energy or nutrition, especially compared to a modern breakfast that might include eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, orange juice, and coffee. You would likely still feel hungry after eating, but there would be no mid-morning snack to look forward to. The ancient Greeks typically ate only 2 main meals per day, a light meal around midday and a larger meal in the evening. You would need to wait many hours before eating again. The lack of coffee or tea would be another significant challenge. The ancient Greeks did not have access to caffeine in any form. Coffee comes from plants native to Point Africa and was not known in poor ancient Greece. Tea comes from China and was similarly unknown. If you are accustomed to drinking coffee or tea in the morning to help you wake up and feel alert, you would struggle without it. You would likely feel sluggish and foggy-headed, unable to achieve the level of alertness and focus you are used to. After breakfast, you would need to begin the day's work. What this work entailed would depend on your social status and occupation in ancient Greek society. Let us consider several possibilities, as each would present its own set of challenges that would make it difficult for you to last a day in ancient Greece. If you were a farmer, which the majority of ancient Greeks were, you would need to go out to your fields and tend to your crops. Greek agriculture was labor-intensive and relied entirely on human and animal power. As there were no tractors or other mechanized equipment, you would be working with simple tools, including a wooden plow, which might be tipped with iron if you were relatively prosperous, and various hand tools, such as hoes, sickles, and mattocks. The work would be physically exhausting. Plowing a field with a simple wooden plow pulled by oxen required tremendous effort to guide the plow and keep it at the correct depth in the soil. If you were plowing, you would need to walk behind the plow all day, struggling to control it as it bounced over rocks and roots. Your hands would develop blisters from gripping the plow handles, and your arms and back would ache from the constant strain. If you were hoeing or weeding, you would need to bend over repeatedly, which would cause severe back pain if you were not accustomed to this posture. The sun would beat down on you as there would be no shade in the fields. You would become very hot and would sweat profusely. The only water available would be what you had brought with you from home in a clay jug, and it would quickly become warm and stale tasting. The crops you would be tending would primarily be grain, particularly barley and wheat, along with grapes, olives, and figs. The soil in much of Greece is thin and rocky, not particularly fertile, which meant that farming was challenging and yields were often modest. You would need to work very hard for relatively little return. The constant worry about whether the crops would be sufficient to feed your family through the winter would add psychological stress to the physical hardship. If you were a craftsman, you would face different but equally challenging conditions. Let us consider the example of a potter, as pottery was an important craft in ancient Greece. You would work in a small workshop, probably attached to your home. The workshop would be hot, especially in summer, as it would contain a kiln for firing the pottery. The kiln would be heated by burning wood, and tending it would be hot, uncomfortable work. Creating pottery would require skill that takes years to develop. You would need to prepare the clay by removing stones and other impurities, then kneading it to the right consistency. This kneading would be done by hand or by treading the clay with your feet, both of which would be tiring. You would then shape the clay on a potter's wheel, which would be turned by hand or by an assistant. Creating a symmetrical vessel on a wheel requires practice and concentration, and your early attempts would likely be misshapen failures. After shaping the pottery, it would need to dry slowly to prevent cracking. Then it would be decorated, perhaps with painted designs. The Greeks created beautiful pottery with elaborate scenes from mythology and everyday life, but these designs required steady hands and artistic skill. If you do not have these skills, your pottery would be crude and unsellable. Finally, the pottery would be fired in the kiln, a process that required careful control of temperature and timing to prevent the pottery from cracking or exploding. The economic pressure would be intense. You would need to produce enough pottery to sell to support yourself and your family. There would be no steady paycheck, no benefits, no sick days. If you could not produce quality pottery, you would not earn money, and you would bawl and your family would go hungry. This constant economic insecurity would create stress that most modern people are not equipped to handle. If you were a merchant, you would face the challenges of ancient commerce. Trade in ancient Greece was conducted in the agora, the marketplace, which was an open public space in the center of the city. You would need to transport your goods to the agora, set up your stall, or simply spread your goods on the ground and then spend the day trying to sell them. The goods you were selling might be produced from your farm, pottery, or other crafts you had made, or items you had acquired through trade with others. You would need to negotiate with customers, haggling over prices. Ancient Greeks loved to bargain and would consider it insulting if you simply stated a fixed price. You would need to be quick-witted and persuasive, able to argue for the quality of your goods and the fairness of your prices. The agora would be crowded, noisy, and chaotic. There would be many other merchants competing for the same customers. You would need to call out to attract attention to your wares, adding to the general din. The sun would be hot, as there would be limited shade. You would be on your feet all day, which would be exhausting. There would be no place to sit down comfortably, no restroom facilities, and no opportunity to get a drink of water unless you brought your own. Currency in ancient Greece consisted of coins made of silver, bronze, or occasionally gold. These coins were irregularly shaped and varied in weight and purity. There was no standardized system, and different city-states minted their own coins. You would need to be able to judge the value of coins by their weight and appearance, as there would be no guarantee that a coin was what it purported to be. Counterfeit coins were a problem, and accepting a fake coin could mean a significant loss. If you were a woman in ancient Greece, your situation would be particularly constrained. Women of respectable families were expected to remain largely confined to the home. They would not go to the agora to shop. Instead, male household members or slaves would do the shopping. Women would not participate in politics, attend most public events, or socialize freely with men outside their family. Your days would be spent managing the household, which involved supervising slaves if the family had any, spinning and weaving cloth, preparing food, and caring for children. The work would be repetitive and monotonous. Spinning thread from raw wool or flax fibers was particularly tedious, as it required sitting for hours turning a spindle while carefully drawing out the fibers into an even thread. Weaving on a vertical loom required standing for long periods and performing the same motions over and over. The isolation would be difficult for a modern person to bear. You would have limited social contact outside your immediate family. Your world would be bounded by the walls of your home, and perhaps the homes of a few neighbors. You would have no career, no independence, no political voice. Your entire existence would be defined by your relationships to men, first your father, then your husband. Even your name would rarely be spoken in public, as it was considered inappropriate to mention a respectable woman's name outside the family. If you were a slave, your situation would be even more difficult. Slavery was common in ancient Greece, and slaves performed much of the labor in Greek society. Slaves could be prisoners of war, children of slaves, or people who had been captured by pirates or sold by their families due to poverty. As a slave, you would have no legal rights. You would be the property of your master, who could sell you, punish you physically, or even kill you with little fear of consequences. The work required of slaves varied. Some slaves worked in the home, cooking, cleaning, and caring for children. Others worked in the fields or in workshops. The worst fate was to be sent to work in the silver mines at Laurium, where conditions were brutal. Slaves in the mines worked in cramped, dark tunnels deep underground, chipping away at the rock to extract silver ore. The work was dangerous. The clean air was bad, and many slaves died from accidents, disease, or simply from exhaustion. Even household slaves faced hard work and harsh treatment. You would be expected to be available at all times to serve your master's needs. You would sleep on the floor or on a simple mat, and you would eat whatever scraps were left over from your master's meals. You would be beaten if you made mistakes or if your master was simply in a bad mood. You would have no hope of escape and no prospect of freedom unless your master chose to free you, which was rare. Let us now turn to the question of the midday meal. As mentioned earlier, the ancient Greeks typically ate a light meal around midday. This meal, like breakfast, would be simple. It might consist of bread, cheese, olives, and perhaps some dried fish or vegetables. The bread would be the same dense barley or wheat bread eaten at breakfast. The cheese would be the same strong-tasting sheep or goat cheese. The olives would be just as salty as those eaten in the morning. The dried fish would be very salty, as salting was the primary method of preserving fish in the days before refrigeration. The fish would need to be soaked in water before eating to remove some of the salt, but even so, it would be much saltier than modern people are accustomed to. The vegetables might include onions, garlic, leeks, cabbage, or legumes such as lentils or chickpeas. These would typically be boiled, as there was no butter or other fat for cooking except olive oil, which was expensive and used sparingly. This meal would be eaten quickly, perhaps without even sitting down properly. There would be no leisurely lunch break, no restaurant to go to, no takeout food to order. You would simply eat what was available, as quickly as possible, then return to work. The meal would not be particularly filling or satisfying, and you would probably still be hungry afterward. But again, you would need to wait until the evening meal to eat again. The lack of variety in the diet would be monotonous and frustrating. Day after day, you would eat the same foods: bread, cheese, olives, perhaps some fish or vegetables. There would be no sugar or sweets except occasionally honey, which was expensive. There would be no chocolate, no ice cream, no cake or cookies. There would be no coffee, tea, or soft drinks. There would be no meat except on special occasions, as most families could not afford to eat meat regularly. The drinking water, when you drank water rather than diluted wine, would not be clean by modern standards. Water would be drawn from wells, springs, or cisterns that collected rainwater. This water might contain various impurities and microorganisms. Many Greeks preferred to drink wine, even diluted wine, because they recognized that water could make them sick, though they did not understand why. As a modern person, your system would not be accustomed to these impurities, and you would likely suffer from gastrointestinal problems, including stomach cramps and diarrhea. After the midday meal, work would continue through the afternoon. The heat of the day would make the work even more uncomfortable than it had been in the morning. If you were working outdoors, the sun would be intense, and there would be little opportunity for shade or rest. If you were working indoors in a workshop, the lack of ventilation would make the space stuffy and hot. You would sweat constantly, and the salt lost through sweating would make you feel weak and dizzy if you could not replace it. The work would continue until sunset or shortly before. The ancient Greeks organized their days around the sun, and work would end when there was no longer enough light to see by. There were no electric lights to extend the workday, and oil lamps and candles were too expensive to use for work. Once it became dark, most activities would cease, and people would prepare for the evening meal and then for sleep. The evening meal was the main meal of the day. This was called depnon, and it was typically eaten in the late afternoon or early evening. For most families, this meal would not be much more elaborate than the earlier meals, though it might include a hot dish such as a stew or porridge. The stew might contain vegetables and legumes, and if the family was prosperous, a small amount of meat. The porridge might be made from barley or wheat cooked with water or milk. For wealthy families, the evening meal could be much more elaborate. There might be multiple courses including fish, game birds, vegetables prepared in various ways, bread, cheese, olives, nuts, and fruits. The food would be flavored with olive oil, vinegar, and herbs such as oregano, mint, and coriander. Wine would be served, diluted, according to the preferences of the drinkers. After the meal, there might be entertainment, including music, poetry, or conversation. However, even a wealthy family's meal would be quite different from bowling, what you might expect. The food would be eaten while reclining on couches, which would feel awkward and uncomfortable if you are not used to it. You would eat with your hands, as forks had not yet been invented. Spoons and knives were available, but much food would simply be picked up with the fingers or scooped up with pieces of bread. Your hands would become greasy and messy, and there would be no paper napkins, only cloth that would need to be washed later. The lack of modern conveniences in food preparation would be evident in the taste and texture of the food. Everything would need to be cooked over an open fire or in a clay oven. Temperature control would be difficult, and food might be burned on the outside while still raw inside, or it might be overcooked and dried out. There would be no refrigeration, so leftovers could not be safely kept. Any food not eaten would need to be consumed quickly, or it would spoil. The seasonings available would be limited. Salt was expensive as it needed to be obtained from the sea or from salt deposits and then transported. Pepper and other exotic spices from the east were extremely expensive and would only be available to the very wealthy. The Greeks used herbs that grew locally, but the range of flavors would be quite limited compared to what you can access in any modern supermarket. After the evening meal, there would be little to do. Without electric lights, the house would be dark except for the light from a few oil lamps or candles. These provided very dim light, not sufficient for reading or for doing detailed work. Most people would simply sit and talk, perhaps working on simple tasks that could be done by feel, such as carding wool or repairing tools. Children would be put to bed, and adults would follow soon after, as there was little point in staying up in the dark. The social life that did exist in the evening was largely restricted to men. Wealthy men might attend a symposium, which was a drinking party, where men would recline on couches, drink wine, converse, and sometimes enjoy entertainment from musicians, dancers, or hired companions. These symposia were important social and political occasions, but women of respectable families were not invited. A bonneman's evening would be spent at home with her family. The sleeping arrangements we described at the beginning of this account would present the same challenges at night as they did in the morning. The uncomfortable bed, the lack of climate control, the noise from outside or from other family members in the small house, all of these would interfere with your ability to get a good night's sleep. You would likely toss and turn, unable to find a comfortable position. The bed would be too hard, the blanket too scratchy, the pillow too flat. If you needed to use the bathroom during the night, you would face another challenge. Ancient Greek homes did not have indoor plumbing. There would be no toilet, no bathroom. Instead, there would be a chamber pot in the bedroom, which you would use the bathroom. During the night, you would face another challenge. Ancient Greek homes did not have indoor plumbing. There would be no toilet, no bathroom. Instead, there would be a chamber pot in the bedroom, which you would use during the night. This chamber pot would be emptied in the morning into a cesspit outside the house or simply thrown into the street. The lack of privacy and the unpleasant smell of the chamber pot would be distasteful to modern sensibilities. Throughout this entire day, from dawn to dusk and into the night, you would be uncomfortable, hungry, tired, and stressed. You would lack the basic conveniences that modern life provides, and that you take for granted. You would lack clean running water, comfortable clothing and shoes, adequate food, effective medicine, and countless other things that make modern life bearable. You would be working much harder physically than you are accustomed to, while also dealing with psychological stress from economic insecurity, social constraints, and the general harshness of life. Chapter 2. The urban environment and infrastructure. Let us now consider in more detail the physical environment of an ancient Greek city and how it would affect your experience. The city would be quite different from any modern city you have experienced. The streets would not be paved with asphalt or concrete, but rather would be dirt paths that became muddy when it rained and dusty when it was dry. In some areas, particularly in wealthier districts, the streets might be paved with stones, but even these would be uneven and difficult to walk on. The streets would be narrow, often only wide enough for two people to pass each other, or for a single donkey or cart to pass through. There would be no sidewalks, no street lights, no traffic signals. The street would be used not only for walking, but also as an open sewer. People would throw garbage, waste water, and even the contents of doink chamber pots into the street. This would create a terrible smell and would attract flies, rats, and other vermin. Walking through the streets would require watching your step constantly to avoid stepping in something unpleasant. The buildings lining the streets would be closely packed together, often sharing walls. Most buildings would be 1 or 2 stories high, built of mud, brick on a stone foundation, with a flat roof or a simple peaked roof covered with clay tiles. The walls would be plastered and whitewashed, which would help reflect heat and keep the interiors cooler. However, the whitewash would quickly become dirty from the dust and smoke in the air. The windows, as mentioned earlier, would be small openings without glass. During the day, these might be left open for light and ventilation, though this would also allow in dust, insects, and noise from the street. At night or in bad weather, the windows would be closed with wooden shutters. The lack of glass windows meant that the interiors of buildings would be quite dark even during the day, and it would be difficult to keep out cold air in winter or hot air in summer. The noise level in the city would be quite high. Without cars or other motor vehicles, the main sources of noise would be human voices, animals, and various work activities. People would be talking, shouting, arguing, and haggling in the agora. Children would be playing and crying. Craftsmen would be hammering, sawing, and operating various tools. Merchants would be calling out to advertise their wares. Animals including donkeys, horses, chickens, pigs, and dogs would be making their characteristic sounds. The cumulative effect would be a constant din that would make it difficult to think or concentrate. The smell of the city would be equally overwhelming. In addition to the killer smells from the garbage and waste in the streets, there would be smells from various workshops and businesses. Tanneries, where leather was processed, produced a particularly noxious odor from the chemicals used to treat the hides. Dye works, where cloth was colored, also produced strong smells. Fishmongers selling fresh fish in the agora would contribute to the odor, especially in hot weather when fish would spoil quickly. People themselves would contribute to the smell. As we discussed earlier, bathing was not as frequent or thorough as it is today, and most people would have significant body odor. Clothes would not be washed frequently, as washing required significant labor to heat water and scrub the clothes. Wool, the most common fabric, tends to retain odors more than modern synthetic fabrics. The cumulative effect of all these smells would be something most modern people would find nauseating. The sanitation situations would be particularly challenging. There was no municipal water supply system in most Greek cities, at least not in the sense of pipes delivering water to individual homes. Instead, water would be obtained from public fountains, wells, or springs. These water sources might be some distance from your home, requiring you to walk there and back carrying heavy jars of water. This would need to be done multiple times per day to meet the household's needs for drinking, cooking, and washing. There was also no sewage system to carry away wastewater and human waste. As mentioned, the chamber pot would be emptied into a cesspit or into the street. Wastewater from washing and cooking would also be thrown into the street. In some cities, there might be public latrines, which would be buildings with benches containing holes over a pit or a channel that might be flushed with water. These latrines would be communal, with no privacy between users, and they would smell terrible. The risk of disease in this environment would be significant. Without understanding of germ theory, the Greeks did not know that disease could be transmitted through contaminated water, food, or physical contact. They did not know to wash their hands before eating or after using the latrine. They did not know to keep food preparation areas clean. As a result, diseases spread easily, particularly diseases of the digestive system such as dysentery and typhoid fever. You, as a modern person with a modern immune system, would be particularly vulnerable to these diseases. Your immune system would not have been exposed to the specific pathogens common in ancient Greece, and you would have no resistance. You would likely become sick very quickly, possibly within hours or days of arriving in ancient Greece. The sickness might be mild, such as traveler's diarrhea, or it might be severe and potentially fatal. Medical care, should you become sick, would be rudimentary at best. Greek physicians did have some knowledge and skill, but their understanding of disease was based on the theory of the four humours, which bore no relation to reality. They might prescribe various herbal remedies, some of which might have some beneficial effect, but many of which would be useless or even harmful. They might recommend bloodletting, which involves cutting a vein to let out blood, based on the theory that many diseases were caused by an excess of blood. This treatment would actually make you weaker and more likely to die. Surgery was available for certain conditions, such as setting broken bones or removing kidney stones, but without anesthesia or antiseptics. Surgery was extremely painful and dangerous. Many patients died from shock during the operation or from infection afterward. If you became seriously ill or injured, your chances of survival would be much lower than they would be in the modern world with its hospitals, antibiotics, and advanced medical technology. Let us consider the public spaces of the city in more detail. The agora, as mentioned, was the central marketplace and gathering place. It would be a large open area, perhaps paved with stones or simply packed dirt. Around the edges would be stoa, which were covered walkways with columns supporting a roof. These stoa provided shade and shelter from rain, and they were used as locations for shops and as places for people to gather and socialize. The agora would be crowded and chaotic. In addition to the merchants selling their goods, there would be money changers, scribes offering their services to write letters or documents for those who were illiterate, lawyers and politicians giving speeches, philosophers teaching their students, and citizens gathering to discuss politics and current events. The constant activity and noise would be overwhelming, and the press of bodies in a confined space would be uncomfortable, especially in hot weather. The Acropolis, if the city had one, would be a fortified hill topped with temples and other important buildings. The most famous Acropolis is in Athens, with its magnificent temples including the Parthenon. These temples were architectural marvels, built of marble and adorned with elaborate sculptures and decorations. However, they were religious sites, not tourist attractions, and casual visitors were not necessarily welcome. Religious observances were taken seriously, and inappropriate behavior could result in punishment. Climbing to the Acropolis would be physically demanding, as the path would be steep and might consist of uneven steps carved into the rock. For someone not accustomed to physical exertion, the climb would leave you winded and exhausted. Once at the top, the view would be spectacular, but there would be nowhere to sit and rest. No vendors selling drinks or snacks, no restrooms. You would need to climb back down when you were ready to leave, which would be almost as tiring as the climb up. The theater was another important public space in a Greek city. Greek theaters were open-air structures, typically built into a hillside so that the seats could be arranged in a semicircle, rising up the slope. The seats were stone benches, hard and uncomfortable, with no backs. A performance at a Greek theater could last for many hours, and sitting on these hard benches for that long would be quite painful. There would be no cushions, no armrests, no cup holders for your drink. The performances themselves would be quite different from modern theater. Greek drama consisted of tragedies and comedies, performed by actors wearing masks and elaborate costumes. The actors were all men. Women were not allowed to perform. The plays were part of religious festivals and were taken very seriously. The audience was expected to sit quietly and pay attention. There would be no talking, no eating snacks, no checking your phone. Any disruption could result in being thrown out or even punished. The gymnasium was another important public institution. The gymnasium was a place where men would exercise, train for athletic competition, and socialize. It typically included an open courtyard for exercise, covered walkways, and rooms for various activities. Men would exercise nude, as the Greeks believed this was the natural and proper way to train. This would be quite shocking to modern sensibilities and would make many people uncomfortable. The exercises performed at the gymnasium were primarily running, jumping, throwing the discus, and javelin, and wrestling. These were the bunful events of the Olympic Games, other athletic competitions. Training for these events was serious business, as athletic success brought great honor. Men would train for hours each day, pushing their bodies to the limit. If you were expected to participate, you would quickly find that you lacked the strength, endurance, and skill to keep up, and you would be exhausted and sore. Women were not allowed at the gymnasium, just as they were excluded from most public spaces and activities. This exclusion would be frustrating and alienating for a modern woman, who is accustomed to having access to public facilities and participating in public life. The constant reminder that you were considered inferior and needed to be confined to the domestic sphere would be psychologically damaging. Chapter 3: Social Relations and Cultural Expectations. The social structure of ancient Greek society would be another major challenge. Greek society was highly stratified, with clear distinctions between citizens, foreigners, and slaves. Even among citizens, there were distinctions based on wealth and family background. Your position in this hierarchy would determine almost every aspect of your life, including where you could go, what you could do, and whom you could interact with. To be a citizen was a privilege. Only men whose parents were both citizens could be citizens themselves. Women, even if both their parents were citizens, were not citizens in the political sense. They could not vote, hold office, or participate in the assembly. Foreigners, even if they lived in the city for their entire lives, could not become citizens. Slaves, of course, had no rights at all. The privileges of citizenship included the right to own land, to participate in politics, and to receive protection under the law. Citizens were also expected to fulfill certain duties, including military service. All male citizens were liable to be called up for military duty, and they were expected to provide their own weapons and armor. The nature of military service will be discussed in more detail later, but suffice it to say that it was dangerous and burdensome. The relationships between people of different social classes were governed by strict customs and expectations. A slave would be expected to be deferential and obedient to free people. A poor citizen would show respect to a wealthy citizen. A young person would show respect to an older person. These social hierarchies were maintained through a combination of law, custom, and the threat of violence or social exclusion for those who violated the norms. If you failed to show proper respect to someone of higher status, you could face serious consequences. You might be beaten, fined, or ostracized. Your family might suffer from your failure, as family members were expected to control each other's behavior. The constant need to monitor your behavior and show proper deference would be stressful and exhausting, especially for someone from a modern egalitarian society where such rigid social hierarchies are not enforced. The language barrier would be another significant challenge. Ancient Greek is quite different from modern English, and even if you had studied ancient Greek, you would likely find the spoken language difficult to understand. The Greeks spoke quickly and used many idioms and cultural references that would be unfamiliar to you. You would struggle to communicate even basic needs and would frequently misunderstand what others were saying to you. Writing in ancient Greek would be even more challenging. The alphabet is different from the Latin alphabet used for English, and the writing system did not include punctuation or spaces between words. Everything was written in capital letters in a continuous string. Reading such text would be slow and difficult, and writing it yourself would be nearly impossible without extensive practice. The fact that literacy was limited to a small percentage of the population meant that most people could not read or write at all, which would limit your ability to access information or communicate over distance. The concept of time in ancient Greece was quite different from our modern understanding. The Greeks divided the day into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness, but the length of these hours varied with the seasons. In summer, when the days were long, a daytime hour would be longer than a nighttime hour. In winter, the reverse would be true. This variable system would be confusing and would make it difficult to plan activities or keep appointments. The Greeks did not have clocks in the modern sense. Water clocks and sundials existed, but they were not common and were not very accurate. Most people judged the time by the position of the sun in the sky or by the activities of the day. You would be told to meet someone at the agora in the morning, but this might mean any time from dawn to midday. The lack of precise timekeeping would make coordination difficult and would lead to much waiting around for others to appear. The calendar was also different. The Greeks used a lunar calendar with months beginning at the new moon. However, different city-states had different calendars with different month names and different starting points for the year. This lack of standardization would make it difficult to keep track of dates or to communicate about timing with people from different cities. The Greeks did not have a continuous counting of years as we do with the AD-BC system. Instead, they might refer to the year by the name of an official or by counting years from a significant event. Religious observances would be another area where you would struggle. Religion permeated every aspect of Greek life. There were gods and goddesses for every aspect of existence, and they needed to be honored with prayers, offerings, and sacrifices. Failing to honor the gods properly could bring divine punishment, not only on you but on your entire family or even your entire city. The pressure to perform religious rituals correctly would be significant. Many of these rituals would seem strange or even disturbing to modern sensibilities. Animal sacrifice was a central part of Greek religion. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs would be killed as offerings to the gods. The animal would be led to an altar, and a priest would cut its throat while prayers were recited. The blood would be poured on the altar, and certain parts of the animal, particularly the fat and bones, would be burned as an offering to the gods. The meat would then be distributed among the worshippers and eaten. If you were expected to participate in a sacrifice, you would need to perform your role correctly. This might involve leading the animal to the altar, holding it while it was killed, or assisting with the butchering and distribution of the meat. If you showed revulsion or refused to participate, you would be seen as impious and might face social or legal consequences. Yet watching an animal be killed, or worse, participating in the killing, would be traumatic for most modern people who have no experience with such things. Religious festivals were frequent and were important social occasions. These festivals might involve processions through the city, athletic competitions, dramatic performances, and sacrifices. Participation was expected, and failing to participate would mark you as an outsider or a troublemaker. The festivals could last for several days, during which normal work would be suspended. While this might seem like a welcome break, it also meant that you would not be earning money or producing food during that time, which could create economic hardship. The Greek concept of specialty, known as xenia, was another important cultural value. Hosts were expected to provide food, shelter, and protection to guests, even strangers. Guests were expected to be gracious and respectful. Violating the rules of hospitality, either as a host or as a guest, was considered a serious offense that could anger the gods. If you failed to show proper hospitality or gratitude, you would be judged harshly and might find it difficult to get help or support from others in the future. The role of violence in Greek society would also be challenging. While the Greeks valued reason, philosophy, and democracy, they also accepted violence as a normal part of life. Slavery was maintained through violence or the threat of violence. Husbands had the legal right to beat their wives. Parents could beat their children. Disputes might be settled through physical combat. The constant presence of violence, or the threat of it, would create an atmosphere of fear and tension that would be difficult to endure. Warfare was a particular problem. Greek city-states were frequently at war with each other or with foreign powers. If you were a male citizen, you could be called up for military service at any time. You would be expected to provide your own armor and weapons, which were expensive. The most common form of armor was the hoplite panoply, which consisted of a bronze helmet, a bronze breastplate or corselet, bronze greaves to protect the shins, and a large round shield called a hoplon. This armor was heavy, weighing perhaps 50 to 70 pounds. Wearing it would be hot and exhausting. The helmet would limit your vision and hearing, and the breastplate would restrict your breathing and movement. You would need to march long distances while carrying this heavy load, along with your weapons, which would include a long spear and a short sword. The physical demands would be enormous, and without training and conditioning, you would quickly become exhausted. If you actually fought in a battle, the experience would be terrifying. Greek warfare typically involved hoplites forming a phalanx, which was a dense formation of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping. The phalanx would advance toward the enemy phalanx, and when they met, there would be a brutal shoving match, with men trying to push the enemy back while stabbing with their spears over and around their shields. The noise would be deafening, the clash of metal on metal, the screams of wounded men, the shouted orders and war cries. The press of bodies would be claustrophobic. The smell of blood, sweat, and fear would be overwhelming. Men would be falling dead or wounded all around you. You would be terrified, and yet you would need to keep fighting, because if the phalanx broke, everyone would be vulnerable to being cut down from behind as they fled. If you survived the battle, you would likely be traumatized. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not recognized in ancient times, but it certainly existed. You would have nightmares and might be unable to function normally. Yet there would be no counseling, no support services. You would be expected to simply carry on, as if nothing had happened. If you showed signs of fear or weakness, you would be mocked and shamed. The psychological toll would be severe. Chapter 4: Daily Hardships and the Absence of Modern Medicine. Let us examine in more detail some of the specific hardships you would face in everyday life. One of the most significant would be the lack of effective pain relief. In the modern world, if you have a headache, you can take aspirin or ibuprofen. If you have a toothache, you can see a dentist. If you injure yourself, you can go to a hospital. In ancient Greece, none of these options existed. For minor pain, such as a headache or muscle ache, you would simply have to endure it. There were some herbal remedies that might help slightly. Willow bark, which contains a chemical similar to aspirin, might provide some warmth relief if you chewed it or made it into a tea. Opium was available and was an effective pain reliever, but it was expensive and not readily accessible to ordinary people. Most of the time you would just have to suffer through the pain and hope it would eventually go away. For more serious pain, such as a broken bone or a severe wound, the situation would be even worse. A broken bone would need to be set, which meant manipulating the bone back into proper alignment. This would be excruciatingly painful, as there was no anesthesia. You might be given wine to dull the pain slightly, or you might be given a piece of leather to bite down on, to keep from screaming, but that would be the extent of pain management. The setting itself might be done incorrectly, resulting in a bone that healed crooked, causing permanent disability and chronic pain. A serious wound, such as a deep cut, would be at high risk of infection. Without antibiotics or proper wound care, even a relatively minor wound could become infected and lead to serious illness or death. The Greeks would clean wounds with wine or vinegar, which had some antiseptic properties, and they might apply various poultices made from herbs or other substances, but these treatments were not very effective. If infection set in, causing the wound to become red, swollen, and filled with pus, there was little that could be done, except to hope the body would fight off the infection on its own. If the infection spread, causing fever and delirium, the person would likely die. Sepsis, a systemic infection of the bloodstream, was almost always fatal in the ancient world. You would watch helplessly as you or a loved one became sicker and weaker, until finally death came. This happened regularly, and people lived with the constant awareness that any injury or illness could be fatal. Dental problems would be particularly troublesome. Tooth decay was common due to the coarse bread that was a staple of the diet. The grain was ground using millstones, and small particles of stone would often end up in the flour. This gritty bread would wear down the teeth over time, exposing the pulp and causing pain and infection. There were no dentists in the modern sense, and no way to fill cavities or perform root canals. If a tooth became too painful, the only solution was to have it pulled. This would be done without anesthesia, using a tool, rather like pliers, to grip the tooth and yank it out. The pain would be intense, and the extraction might damage the surrounding teeth or jaw. After the tooth was removed, the socket would take weeks to heal, during which time it would be painful to eat. If infection set in, it could spread to the jawbone, causing even more serious problems. Many people in ancient Greece would have lost most or all of their teeth by middle age, making it difficult to eat anything that required chewing. They would be limited to soft foods, like porridge, which would be monotonous and not very nutritious. The lack of teeth would also affect their appearance and their speech, making them seem old and decrepit even if they were still relatively young. Vision problems would be another challenge. Eyeglasses had not been invented, so if you were nearsighted or farsighted, there would be no way to correct your vision. You would simply have to live with blurry vision. If you needed to do close work, such as reading or sewing, you would struggle and might develop headaches from the strain. If you could not see clearly at a distance, you would have difficulty recognizing people or navigating unfamiliar places. As you aged, your vision would naturally deteriorate, a condition called presbyopia that makes it difficult to focus on close objects. In the modern world, reading glasses can correct this problem, but in ancient Greece, you would simply have to accept that you could no longer read or do fine work. This would be particularly problematic if your livelihood depended on such work. Hearing loss would be similarly uncorrectable. If you were deaf or hard of hearing, either from birth or due to age or injury, there would be no hearing aids to help you. You would struggle to understand what people were saying and would often miss important information. People might assume you were stupid or rude if you did not respond appropriately to what was said. Your social isolation would increase as communication became more difficult. Chronic conditions that we can manage today would be debilitating in ancient Greece. Diabetes, for example, would be a death sentence. Without insulin or even a proper understanding of the disease, a diabetic person would gradually waste away as their body failed to properly process glucose. They would be constantly thirsty and would urinate frequently. They would lose weight despite eating. They would feel weak and tired all the time. Eventually, they would fall into a coma and die. Asthma would be another serious problem. Without inhalers or other medications, an asthma attack could be fatal. The person would struggle to breathe, gasping for air while their chest tightened and wheezing with each breath. All that could be done was to try to keep them calm and hope the attack would pass. If it did not, they would suffocate. Epilepsy, which we now understand as a neurological disorder that can be controlled with medication, was thought to be a sacred disease, possibly a form of divine possession. People with epilepsy would have seizures during which they would fall to the ground, convulse, and lose consciousness. These seizures were frightening to witness and could cause injury if the person fell on something hard or sharp. There was no effective treatment, and people with epilepsy lived in fear of when the next seizure might strike. Mental illness would also be poorly understood and stigmatized. Depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and other mental health conditions were thought to be caused by an imbalance of the humors or by divine punishment. Treatment might involve trying to rebalance the humors through diet, bloodletting, or purging, none of which would be effective. People with serious mental illness might be confined to their homes or even chained up to prevent them from harming themselves or others. The lack of understanding and compassion for mental illness would make the suffering even worse. Childbirth was particularly dangerous for women. Without modern obstetric care, complications during labor could easily result in the death of the mother, the baby, or both. If the baby was in the wrong position, if the mother hemorrhaged, if the labor went on too long, there was little that could be done. Midwives had some skills and knowledge, but their interventions were limited. The maternal mortality rate was high, and every pregnancy was a risk to the mother's life. Even if the birth went smoothly, the risks did not end. Infections could develop after birth, causing fever and potentially death. The baby itself was vulnerable to numerous threats. Infant mortality was extremely high, with perhaps 1/3 or more of children dying before their first birthday. They might die from disease, malnutrition, accidents, or peace simply from unknown causes. Parents lived with the constant fear that their children might die, and many families experienced the loss of one or more children. The prevalence of disease in ancient Greece would be another constant threat. Malaria was common in marshy areas, causing recurring fevers, weakness. Typhoid fever, spread through contaminated water and food, could kill in a matter of days. Dysentery caused severe diarrhea that could lead to fatal dehydration. Tuberculosis was a chronic, wasting disease that slowly destroyed the lungs. Leprosy caused disfiguring sores and led to social ostracism. Plague could wipe out large portions of the population when it struck. You would live in constant fear of disease. Every time you felt a slight fever or a stomachache, you would wonder if this was the start of something serious. You would watch neighbors and family members sicken and die, never knowing when it might be your turn. The psychological stress of this constant threat would be enormous. You would have nightmares and would struggle with anxiety and depression. The lack of basic hygiene producting would compound the health risks. There would be no soap as we know it, no shampoo, no deodorant, no toothpaste. The Greeks used olive oil for cleaning, but it was not very effective at removing dirt and bacteria. Your skin would likely have various infections and rashes. Your scalp might be infested with lice, which would cause itching and discomfort and could spread disease. Your clothes would harbor fleas and other parasites. Women would face additional challenges related to menstruation. There were no tampons or sanitary pads. Instead, women would use cloth rags that would need to be washed and reused. These would not provide very good protection and would be uncomfortable and unsanitary. The lack of understanding of menstruation meant that it was often seen as a time when women were unclean or impure, adding psychological distress to the physical discomfort. The physical labor required for daily life would take a toll on the body. Modern people are accustomed to machines doing much of the heavy work, but in ancient Greece, everything had to be done by human or animal power. Carrying water, grinding grain, plowing fields, all of these tasks required significant physical effort, repeated day after day, year after year. The repetitive strain would lead to chronic pain in the joints, back, and muscles. By the time you reached middle age, you would likely be suffering from arthritis, chronic back pain, and general physical deterioration. You would move slowly and painfully, unable to do the work you once did. There would be no retirement, no pension, no nursing home. You would be dependent on your family to care for you, and if they could not or would not, you might be left to beg or starve. The average life expectancy in ancient Greece was perhaps 30 to 35 years, though this figure is skewed by high infant mortality. If you survived childhood, you might live into your 50s or 60s, but you would be considered old by your 40s. The combination of poor nutrition, lack of medical care, hard physical labor, and exposure to disease and injury meant that people aged quickly and died young by modern standards. Watching your body deteriorate and knowing that you had no hope of effective treatment for your ailments would be demoralizing. In the modern world, we take for granted that we can live to be 70, 80, or even 90 years old, remaining relatively healthy and active for much of that time. In ancient Greece, such longevity would be rare, and old age would be a time of pain, weakness, and dependence. Chapter 5. The Climate and Natural Hazards. Let us now consider the climate of ancient Greece and how it would affect your daily experience. Greece has a Mediterranean climate, characterized by hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. While this might sound pleasant, the blunt reality of living without modern climate control would make these conditions quite uncomfortable. In summer, temperatures could regularly reach 90 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, particularly in inland areas. The sun would be intense, beating down from a cloudless sky. There would be no air conditioning, no electric fans, no ice to cool your drinks. The interior of your house would be hot and stuffy, and going outside would offer little relief. The only ways to cope with the heat would be to seek shade, to minimize physical activity during the hottest part of the day, and to drink water when it was available. However, water would be precious in summer. Streams and wells might run dry, and the water that was available. However, water would be precious in summer. Streams and wells might run dry, and the water that was available would be warm and stale tasting. You would be constantly thirsty, and the effort of fetching water in the heat would make you even thirstier. You would sweat profusely, losing salt and fluids, which would make you feel weak and dizzy. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke would be real dangers, especially for people doing physical labor in the sun. At night, the temperature would drop somewhat, but the house would retain heat from the day, making it difficult to sleep. You would lie on your uncomfortable bed, too hot to cover yourself with a blanket, but also bothered by insects that would be attracted to your sweaty skin. Mosquitoes would buzz around your ears and bite you, causing itchy welts. Flies would land on your face. You would toss and turn, unable to find a comfortable position or to escape the heat. In winter, the situation would reverse. While Greek winters are mild compared to those in northern Europe, temperatures could still drop to near freezing, especially at night and in the early morning. Your house would have no central heating, only the small brazier mentioned earlier. This would provide some warmth if you sat very close to it, but it would not heat the entire room, and the heat would quickly dissipate. You would be cold most of the time in winter. Your clothing would not provide adequate insulation, as the Greeks did not have thick, warm fabrics like modern fleece or down. You might wrap yourself in a wool cloak called a himation, but this would be heavy and cumbersome. Your hands and feet would be particularly cold, and you might develop chilblains, which are painful inflammation of the small blood vessels in the skin caused by repeated exposure to cold. The rain in winter would create additional problems. The dirt streets would become muddy, quagmires, difficult to walk through without getting your feet and clothing filthy. Water would leak through the roof of your house if the tiles were not properly maintained. Everything would feel damp and would take a long time to dry. Mold and mildew would grow on clothing, bedding, and walls, creating musty smells and potentially causing respiratory problems. The wind could be fierce at times. Greece is known for its strong winds, particularly the Meltemi that blows in summer from the north and the Etesian winds. These winds would blow dust and debris into your house through the open windows. They would make walking difficult, blowing your clothing and hair in your face. If you were traveling by sea, the so could be dangerous, stirring up waves and making navigation hazardous. Natural disasters would be another constant threat. Greece is seismically active, and earthquakes were a regular occurrence. A major earthquake could destroy buildings, kill many people, and disrupt life for months or years afterward. Without modern building codes or earthquake-resistant construction, ancient Greek buildings were vulnerable to collapse. You would live in fear of feeling the ground begin to shake, never knowing if this would be a minor tremor or a major quake that would destroy everything. Volcanoes were another danger. While mainland Greece did not have active volcanoes, the islands did. The eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, in the Bronze Age was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. Such catastrophic events were rare, but smaller eruptions and earthquake associated with volcanic activity were more common. The psychological stress of not living near a volcano, knowing it could erupt at any time, would be considerable. Floods could occur in winter when heavy rains caused rivers to overflow their banks. Without modern flood control measures, these floods could wash away homes, destroy crops, and kill people and animals. After a flood, there would be no disaster relief, no government assistance. You would simply have to rebuild as best you could and hope that it would not happen again soon. Droughts were perhaps an even greater threat. If the winter rains failed, there would not be enough water for crops. Springs and wells would dry up, people and animals would go thirsty, crops would wither and die in the fields. Famine would follow, and many people would starve. You would watch helplessly as your carefully tended crops died, knowing that you would not have enough food to last until the next harvest. Wildfires were common in summer when vegetation was dry and temperatures were high. A fire started by lightning or human carelessness could quickly spread, consuming forests, fields, and buildings. There were no fire departments, no fire trucks with pumps and hoses. People would try to fight the fire with buckets of water or by beating at the flames with branches, but these methods were rarely effective against a major fire. You would watch your home and livelihood go up in flames, unable to do anything to stop it. Locusts and other agricultural pests could devastate crops. A swarm of locusts could descend on a field and consume everything in a matter of hours, leaving nothing but bare stems. There were no pesticides, no effective way to prevent or control such infestations. You could only hope that the locusts would pass by your fields or that they would not be too numerous. If they did attack your crops, you would lose a year's worth of work and would face hunger. Chapter 6. Travel and Transportation. Let us now examine what travel would be like in ancient Greece. Travel was difficult, dangerous, and time-consuming. There were no cars, trains, or airplanes. The primary means of travel were walking, riding an animal such as a donkey or horse, or traveling by boat. Most people traveled on foot, as animals were expensive and boats were not always available or practical. Walking long distances would be exhausting, especially in the heat of summer, or while carrying luggage. The roads, such as they were, would be rough and unpaved. They might be just dirt paths that wound through the countryside, following the terrain. In hilly areas, which was most of Greece, the paths would be steep and difficult to navigate. Your feet would quickly develop blisters from the rough sandals and the long hours of walking. These blisters might become infected, making walking even more painful. You would need to rest frequently, but there would be few places to rest comfortably. You might find a rock to sit on or a tree to lean against, but there would be no benches, no rest stops, no places to buy a snack or a drink. Water would be a constant concern while traveling. You would need to carry water with you, but water is heavy and peaty and carrying enough for a long journey would be burdensome. You would need to plan your route to pass by springs, wells, or streams where you could refill your water container. If you ran out of water between water sources, you could become dangerously dehydrated. Finding clean water was another challenge, as not all water sources were safe to drink from. Food while traveling would be simple and monotonous. You would carry dried bread, dried fish, cheese, olives, and perhaps some dried fruit or nuts. These foods would keep reasonably well, without refrigeration, but they would not be very appetizing after several days. The bread would become hard and stale. The cheese would become oily and might develop mold. The dried fish would be very salty and tough. You would eat because you needed to, not because the food was enjoyable. Sleeping while traveling would be uncomfortable. There were some inns along major routes, but they were few and far between, and their quality was generally poor. An inn might develop mold. The dried fish would be very salty and tough. You would eat because you needed to, not because the food was enjoyable. Sleeping while traveling would be uncomfortable. There were some inns along major routes, but they were few and far between, and their quality was generally poor. An inn might be nothing more than a single room where travelers would sleep on the floor, packed closely together. There would be no privacy, no clean bedding, no security for your belongings. The other travelers might be thieves or simply unpleasant people. The smell of many unwashed bodies in a confined space would be nauseating. If there was no inn available, you would sleep outdoors. This meant finding a place that offered some shelter from wind and rain, spreading your cloak on the ground, and trying to sleep despite the discomfort, the cold, and the fear of wild animals or bandits. Sleep would be fitful at best, and you would wake feeling stiff, sore, and unrested. Bandits were a real danger on the roads. Groups of armed men might attack travelers to rob them of their money and possessions. If you resisted, they might beat you, injure you, or even kill you. If you submitted, they would take everything of value, leaving you stranded without money, food, or supplies. Solo travelers were particularly vulnerable, which was why people tried to travel in groups when possible. But even a group might be attacked if the bandits were numerous and determined enough. Wild animals were another threat. Wolves, bears, and lions lived in the forests and mountains of ancient Greece. While they generally avoided humans, a hungry or cornered animal might attack. A wolf or bear could kill a person easily, and even if you survived an attack, you would likely be badly injured. There were no rabies vaccinations, so a bite from any animal carried the risk of this fatal disease. If you could afford to ride an animal, the journey would be somewhat easier, but still difficult. Donkeys were the most common riding animals, as they were cheaper and hardier than horses. However, riding a donkey for hours or days would be uncomfortable. The saddle, if there was one, would be a simple pad of cloth or leather. You would develop sores from the constant rubbing and pressure. Your legs and back would ache from sitting in one position. Horses were faster than donkeys, but were expensive to buy and maintain. They needed to be fed grain, which was costly, and they needed regular care from someone with knowledge of horse husbandry. Riding a horse required skill that took time to develop. If you did not know how to ride properly, you might fall off, injuring yourself. The horse might be spooked by something and bolt, throwing you or running away with you clinging desperately to its back. Carts and wagons were used for transporting goods, but they were slow and cumbersome. The roads were not smooth enough for wheeled vehicles in many places, and in hilly terrain, carts were impractical. A loaded cart pulled by oxen might travel only 10 to 15 miles in a day. The ride would be jarring and uncomfortable, as there was no suspension to absorb the point, bumps and jolts from the rough road. Sea travel was an alternative to land travel, and it could be faster for long distances, but it had its own dangers. Ancient Greek ships were powered primarily by oars, with sails used when the wind was favorable. These ships were open boats with no decks, offering no protection from sun, wind, rain, or waves. Passengers and cargo would be exposed to the elements throughout the voyage. Rowing was exhausting work. If you were traveling on a ship as a passenger, you might be expected to help with rowing. The oars were heavy and awkward to handle. The rhythm had to be maintained exactly, or the oars would clash. Your hands would develop blisters that would break and bleed. Your back and arms would burn with fatigue. Hour after hour, you would pull on the oar while the sun beat down and the salt spray dried on your skin. If you were not rowing, you would still be uncomfortable. You would sit or lie among the cargo, trying to find a position that was not too painful. The motion of the ship would make you nauseous, and you might vomit repeatedly, adding to your misery. If a storm came up, waves would crash over the sides of the boat, soaking everyone and everything. The ship would pitch and roll alarmingly, and there would be a real danger of capsizing and drowning. Navigation was primitive. Ships tried to stay within sight of land when possible, following the coastline. Sailing out of sight of land was risky, as it was easy to become lost. Navigators would use the sun and stars to guide them, but this required clear skies. If clouds obscured the sky, navigation became guesswork. Ships might end up far off course, running out of supplies before reaching their destination, or they might run aground on rocks or reefs. Pirates were a constant threat at sea. Pirates would attack merchant ships, killing or enslaving the crew and passengers, and stealing the cargo. A pirate attack would be terrifying. The pirates would approach rapidly in their swift boats, armed with swords, spears, and bows. If you resisted, there would be a fierce battle in the confined space of the ship, with men fighting hand to hand, falling into the sea, and bleeding onto the deck. If you survived, you would likely be taken as a slave and sold in a foreign land, never to see your home or family again. Even without pirates or storms, sea voyages could be unpleasant. Fresh water on board would be limited and would become stale and foul-tasting. Food would be dried or salted provisions that were barely edible. There would be no toilets, just buckets or simply leaning over the side of the ship. Everyone on board would smell terrible, and the close quarters would spread diseases quickly. The average speed of travel in ancient Greece was slow by modern standards. On foot, you might cover 15 to 20 miles in a day of hard walking. By donkey or horse, you might cover 25 to 35 miles in a day. By ship with favorable winds, you might cover 50 to 70 miles in a day. But if the wind was contrary or absent, progress could be much slower. A journey that would take a few hours by car today might take days or weeks in ancient Greece. This slowness had profound effects on life. News traveled slowly, so people might not hear about important events until weeks or months after they occurred. Trade was limited by the time and expense of transportation. If you needed to travel to another city for business or to visit family, you would need to set aside a significant amount of time and resources. Many people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace during their entire lives, simply because travel was so difficult and expensive. Chapter 7. Legal System and Justice. The legal system in ancient Greece would present yet another set of challenges. Greek law was quite different from modern law, and the process of justice would seem strange and unfair by modern standards. There were no professional police forces, no public prosecutors, no defense attorneys. If you were the victim of a crime or if you were accused of a crime, you would largely be on your own. If someone wronged you, it would be your responsibility to bring them to justice. You would need to gather evidence and witnesses. You would need to present your case before a jury or a magistrate. If you could not speak eloquently, or if you were not familiar with the law and legal procedures, you would be at a severe disadvantage. Wealthy people could hire speechwriters to compose their speeches for them, but ordinary people would have to do the best they could. The concept of justice itself was different. Rather than focusing on determining the truth and applying the law fairly, Greek legal proceedings often became contests of rhetoric and emotion. The party who gave the most persuasive speech, who could sway the jury's emotions most effectively, would often win regardless of the actual facts of the case. Juries were large, sometimes consisting of hundreds of citizens, and they were swayed more by passion than by reason. If you were accused of a crime, you could not simply plead innocent and expect a fair trial with the presumption of innocence. You would need to actively defend yourself against the accusation. If you could not present a convincing defense, you might be found guilty even if you were innocent. The burden of proof was not clearly defined, and the standards of evidence were lax. Hearsay and rumor might be accepted as fact. Punishments were often harsh. For minor crimes, you might be fined, but if you could not pay the fine, you might be sold into slavery to satisfy the debt. For more serious crimes, punishments could include imprisonment, exile, or death. Imprisonment was not used as a long-term punishment, but rather as a way to hold someone until trial or until a fine was paid. Prisons were dark, filthy places where prisoners might be chained and left with minimal food and water. Exile was a common punishment for serious offenses. The person would be banished from their city, forbidden to return on pain of death. This meant leaving behind everything and everyone you knew and trying to make a new life in a foreign place where you had no connections or support. Many exiles ended up destitute or turned to piracy or banditry. The death penalty was imposed for various crimes including murder, treason, and serious theft. Methods of execution included being thrown into a pit called a barathron, being forced to drink hemlock poison, or being tied to a board and left to die of exposure. Hemlock poisoning was considered a more dignified death and was the method used to execute the philosopher Socrates. The poison would cause gradual paralysis starting from the extremities and working up to the vital organs, eventually stopping the heart and breathing. The process would take several hours and would be quite unpleasant, though apparently not extremely painful. The lack of due process and the arbitrary nature of justice would be frightening. You could be accused of a crime you did not commit, and if the accuser was wealthy or well-connected, or simply more persuasive than you could be found guilty and punished severely. Even if you were innocent, you might have no effective way to prove it. Certain offenses were handled through rough justice rather than legal proceedings. If a man found another man in his home with his wife, he had the right to kill the intruder without legal consequences, as this was considered a defense of honor. Crimes committed against slaves were not prosecuted, as slaves had no legal standing. If someone killed or injured your slave, you could seek compensation for the damage to your property, but the crime itself was not considered significant. Women had limited access to the legal system. They could not bring lawsuits or testify in court except in very limited circumstances. If a woman was wronged, her male guardian, typically her father or husband, would need to act on her behalf. This meant that women had little recourse if they were mistreated by their guardian, as he would be the one who would need to bring a case against himself. The entire system was biased toward wealthy, well-connected citizens. If you were poor, foreign, a woman, or a slave, you would have little hope of receiving fair treatment from the legal system. You would be vulnerable to exploitation and abuse with no effective means of defending yourself. The constant awareness that you had few legal protections would create a sense of insecurity and fear. Chapter 8. The cumulative burden. As we conclude this examination of why you would not last a day in ancient Greece, it is worth reflecting on the cumulative effect of all these challenges. Each individual hardship we have discussed would be difficult to bear, but taken together, they would be overwhelming. You would wake each day to discomfort and deprivation. You would struggle with inadequate food, uncomfortable clothing, a lack of hygiene, and primitive living conditions. You would work harder than you ever have, performing back-breaking physical labor from dawn to dusk with only simple tools. You would suffer from constant minor ailments and would live in fear of serious illness or injury that could kill you or leave you permanently disabled. You would be constrained by rigid social hierarchies and customs that would limit your freedom and autonomy. You would have few legal protections and would be vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. You would lack access to information and education, leaving you intellectually impoverished. You would have little opportunity for entertainment or diversion, and your leisure time would be spent simply recovering from the day's labors. The psychological toll would be as severe as the physical hardships. The constant stress, fear, discomfort, and boredom would wear you down. You would struggle with anxiety, depression, and hopelessness. You would miss the comforts and conveniences of modern life so intensely that it would be a constant ache. You would dream of hot showers, soft beds, abundant food, air conditioning, modern medicine, and all the other things you once took for granted. The truth is that life in ancient Greece was hard in ways that most modern people cannot truly comprehend. We are so cushioned by modern technology and so accustomed to comfort and convenience that we have lost the ability to endure the hardships that were simply normal for our ancestors. We complain about minor inconveniences that would have seemed like luxuries to an ancient Greek. Chapter 9. Family life and household management. Let us examine in more detail the dynamics of family life and household management, as these would present yet another set of challenges for a modern person. The structure of the ancient Greek household was quite different from the modern nuclear family, and the roles and expectations would feel foreign and constraining. The household, or oikos, was the basic unit of Greek society. It included not only the immediate family but also extended family members, and sometimes lodgers or workers. The head of the household was the oldest male, typically the father or grandfather. He had absolute authority over all household members, including the power to decide whom his children would marry, whether to keep or expose newborn infants, and how household resources would be allocated. This patriarchal structure would be difficult for modern people to accept, particularly women who are accustomed to having autonomy and rights. As a woman in an ancient Greek household, You would be under the authority first of your father, then of your husband. You would have no legal existence separate from your male guardian. You could not own property, make contracts, or conduct business on your own. Your primary role would be to manage the household and produce legitimate heirs. The marriage arrangement itself would be jarring. Marriages were arranged by families, usually when the girl was in her early to mid-teens and the man was in his late 20s or 30s. Love was not a consideration. Marriage was primarily an economic and social arrangement designed to create alliances between families and produce legitimate children. You would have no say in whom you married, and you would be expected to accept your family's choice without complaint. The wedding ceremony would involve the bride being transferred from her father's household to her husband's pagan household. She would be dressed in fine clothes and jewelry, veiled and led in a procession to her new home. Once there, she would be expected to immediately assume her duties as wife and household manager. There would be no honeymoon, no period of adjustment. You would be expected to function competently in your new role from the first day, managing slaves, overseeing food preparation, spinning and weaving, and submitting to your husband's authority and demands. The expectation to produce children would be immediate and intense. A woman's primary value was in bearing legitimate sons to continue the family line. If you did not become pregnant quickly, there would be pressure and perhaps accusations that you were barren. If you gave birth to daughters rather than sons, you would be disappointed, might be blamed, as it was believed that the woman determined the sex of the child. The constant cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing would be exhausting and dangerous, as we have discussed. Raising children would be very different from modern parenting. Infants were tightly swaddled, their arms bound to their sides for much of the first year of life. This was believed to help their limbs grow straight, but it would seem cruel and restrictive by modern standards. Babies were nursed by their mothers, or in wealthy families by wet nurses. Weaning would occur around age 2 or 3, which was later than is common today. Discipline was harsh. Children were expected to be obedient and respectful at all times. Physical punishment was common and accepted. A child who misbehaved might be beaten with a stick or a strap. There was no concept of positive reinforcement or gentle parenting. Children were seen as small adults who needed to be trained and controlled, not as individuals with their own needs and feelings. Boys and girls were raised differently from a young age. Boys from wealthy families would begin formal education around age 7, leaving the women's quarters to study with tutors or attend school. Girls would remain in the women's quarters, learning domestic skills from their mothers and other female relatives. They would learn to spin, weave, cook, manage household supplies, and prepare for their future roles as wives and mothers. The segregation of the sexes within the household was strict. Wealthy homes had separate quarters for men and women. The gyneconitis, or women's quarters, was typically located in the rear of the house or on an upper floor. Women were expected to remain in these quarters most of the time, venturing out only for religious festivals or family emergencies. Male visitors to the house would not be allowed to enter the women's quarters, and women would not appear before male guests, except perhaps briefly and veiled. This confinement would be stifling for a modern woman accustomed to freedom of movement. You would spend most of your time in a few small rooms, seeing the same people day after day. Your world would be bounded by walls, and your horizons would be limited to the concerns of the household. The intellectual and social stimulation you take for granted would be entirely absent. The course of managing a household was constant and labor-intensive. Without modern appliances or conveniences, every task took much longer than it does today. Consider the process of making bread, which was a daily necessity. First, grain would need to be ground into flour using a hand mill consisting of 2 stones. This required significant physical effort, pushing the upper stone around and around while gradually feeding grain between the stones. The grinding process was slow and tiring. It might take an hour or more to grind enough flour for a day's bread. The resulting flour would be coarse and would contain grit from the stones, which, as mentioned earlier, would wear down teeth over time. The flour would then need to be mixed with water, salt, and perhaps some sourdough starter from a previous batch, then kneaded into dough. This kneading was done by hand and required several minutes of hard work to develop the gluten properly. The dough would need to rise, which took several hours. Then it would be shaped into loaves and baked in a clay oven that had been preheated by burning wood inside it. The temperature of the oven could not be precisely controlled, so the bread might be burned or underdone. The entire process from grain to baked bread might take half a day or more. And this would need to be done every day, as bread would go stale quickly and there was no way to preserve it. Preparing other foods was equally time-consuming. Vegetables needed to be grown, harvested, and prepared. Olives needed to be picked, pressed for oil, and cured in brine. Cheese needed to be made from milk, which first needed to be collected from goats or sheep. Every item of food required multiple steps and fed significant labor. A modern person accustomed to buying prepared food or cooking with the aid of modern appliances would be overwhelmed by the sheer amount of work required just to feed a family. Cleaning the house was another endless task. Floors needed to be swept daily to remove dirt and debris tracked in from outside. Without running water, washing things was difficult. Clothes, bedding, and household linens needed to be washed periodically, which involved heating water, soaking the items, scrubbing them, rinsing them, and hanging them to dry. The soap available, such as it was harsh and not very effective. Washing was hard on both the clothes and the hands doing the washing. Spinning them and weaving were constant occupations for born women. Cloth was expensive, and making it at home was a way to save money and keep the household supplied with clothing and linens. Spinning was done with a drop spindle, a simple tool consisting of a stick with a weight on one end. The spinner would draw out fibers from a mass of prepared wool or flax, twist them into thread by spinning the spindle, and wind the finished thread onto the spindle. This process was slow and required skill and constant attention. A skilled spinner might produce enough thread in a day to weave a few inches of cloth. The thread would then be woven on a loom, typically a vertical loom, where the warp threads hung from a beam and the weft threads were passed through them. Weaving was also slow and required concentration to maintain even tension and create a consistent fabric. The finished cloth would be quite coarse by modern standards. It would need to be washed and possibly fulled, a process of beating or treading the cloth to make it denser and softer. Then, it would be cut and sewn into garments. All of this work was done by hand with simple tools. A single garment represented many hours of labor, which was why clothing was precious and was mended and reused until it fell apart. The lighting situation in the household would be another constant frustration. As mentioned, oil lamps and candles provided only dim light. Oil lamps burned olive oil, which was expensive, so lamps would be used sparingly. The lamp consisted of a small clay dish with a spout for the wick. The wick, made of twisted plant, fibers or cloth, would be lit and would burn the oil, producing a small, flickering flame that gave off just enough light to see by as you were close to it. Multiple lamps would be needed to light even a small room, and they would need constant attention. The wicks would need to be trimmed regularly to prevent smoking, and the oil would need to be replenished. The light was uneven and created shadows that made detailed work difficult. Reading or sewing by lamplight would strain the eyes. Most activities would cease at dark simply because it was too difficult to see. The storage of food and other household goods required constant vigilance. Without refrigeration or effective pest control, food spoiled quickly and was vulnerable to being eaten by rodents, insects, or mold. Grain was stored in large clay jars called pithoi, which were sealed to keep out pests. But mice and rats could gnaw through almost anything, and weevils and other insects could infest stored grain. You would need to check supplies regularly and deal with spoilage and infestation as it occurred. Preservation methods were limited to drying, salting, smoking, and storing in oil or honey. Each method had limitations and affected the quality and flavor of the food. Dried fruit and vegetables were leathery and bland. Salted meat and fish were extremely salty and tough. Food stored in oil or honey was expensive, as these preservatives were costly. Fresh food was available only in season, so the diet varied dramatically throughout the year. The rhythm of household life was dictated by the seasons and by the agricultural calendar. Spring was a busy time of planting and of preparing for the summer ahead. Summer brought harvest, work, and the need to process and preserve the produce. Fall involved more harvesting, particularly of olives and grapes, and preparation for winter. Winter was a time of relative rest from agricultural work, but there was still household work to be done. Religious observances and festivals punctuated the year. The household would participate in both public festivals and private rituals. Household shrines to the gods required regular attention, with offerings of food, wine, and incense. Ancestral spirits also needed to be honored with offerings at the family tomb. Failing to properly honor the gods and ancestors could bring misfortune on the household, so these religious duties were taken very seriously. The psychological pressure of managing all these responsibilities would be enormous. As the mistress of a household, you would be judged by how well you managed your duties. A well-run household with clean clothes, good food, and obedient children reflected well on the woman's competence. A poorly run household brought shame and criticism. The daily work was endless, the standards were high, and there was little opportunity for rest or personal time. Relationships within the household could be fraught with tension. The relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law was often difficult, as the older woman might be reluctant to relinquish control and the younger woman might chafe under her authority. Relationships between wives and concubines or slaves who bore the master's children could be poisonous. Sibling rivalry among children competing for parental attention and eventual inheritance could create lasting enmity. The lack of privacy would exacerbate these tensions. In the crowded quarters of even a relatively prosperous household, it would be difficult to find a moment alone or to have a private conversation. Everyone would know everyone else's business. Secrets would be impossible to keep. Conflicts could not be avoided or deferred. They would need to be dealt with immediately in the presence of others. The monotony of daily life would be soul-crushing. Day after day, year after year, the same tasks would need to be performed. The same people would be seen. The same conversations would be had. There would be no novelty, no entertainment beyond occasional festivals. No travel, no opportunity, learn new things, or develop new interests. You would be trapped in a narrow, repetitive existence, with no escape. If you were transplanted into this life from the modern world, you would struggle not only with the physical hardships, but with the psychological ones. The confinement, the lack of autonomy, the endless drudgery, the social constraints, all of these would wear away at your spirit. You would long for the freedoms you once took for granted, the ability to choose your own path, to pursue your own interests, to interact with whomever you wished, to have privacy and personal space. But these things would be utterly beyond your reach, and you would need to accept that your life would be narrow, constrained, and controlled by others until the day you died. If you were transported to ancient Greece, you would likely not last a day before begging to return to the modern world. And if that were not possible, you would spend your remaining days in misery, counting the moments until your suffering ended. This is not to romanticize the past or to suggest that modern life is perfect, but simply to acknowledge that progress has occurred and that we are incredibly fortunate to live in a time of such abundance, health, and opportunity. So as you drift off to sleep tonight in your comfortable bed, in your climate-controlled room, having eaten a satisfying meal and knowing that medical care is available if you need it, take a moment to appreciate these blessings. Reflect on how fortunate you are not to be living in ancient Greece. And sleep well, dear listener, secure in the knowledge that you will wake tomorrow in the modern world, where life, while not perfect, is infinitely more bearable than it was in the ancient past. Good night.